My husband laughed at me during an industry gala, telling everyone I was just a wife with no business sense. 6 weeks later, his luxury hotel chain collapsed when I acquired his biggest investor. He never knew I had been building my own hospitality empire all along. The crystal chandeliers of the Summit Hotel's grand ballroom refracted light across the sea of black ties and designer gowns. Another successful industry gala. At least that's what everyone would call it in tomorrow's hospitality trades. I smoothed the silk of my emerald dress, a carefully chosen statement piece that walked the line between elegant and memorable. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. In this room full of hotel magnates and investors, being forgettable was a liability. Celia, darling, there you are. Anders' voice carried that particular tone he reserved for public appearances, warm on the surface with an undercurrent of command. My husband of 8 years appeared at my side, champagne flute in hand, his other arm immediately circling my waist in what photographers would capture as affection, but I recognized as possession. "The Wilsons were asking about you," he said, steering me toward a couple near the bar. "I told them you've been busy planning our anniversary party next month." I nodded, maintaining the smile I'd perfected over the years. The one that reached my eyes just enough to seem genuine without revealing anything authentic behind it. A professional smile, though Ander would never recognize it as such. Jeffrey Wilson, CEO of Meridian Investments, extended his hand as we approached. "Celia? Wonderful to see you again. Your husband's been telling us about Montgomery Luxury Properties expansion plans. Ambitious move into the Asian market." "Jeff and I were just discussing the financing structure," Ander interjected before I could respond. "The kind of conversation that would bore you to tears, wouldn't it, darling?" He squeezed my shoulder affectionately. To the Wilsons, it would look like consideration. Ander protecting his wife from tedious business talk. I felt the subtle pressure of his fingers, the unspoken reminder of the role I was expected to play. "Crystal was just telling me about your background in hotel management before you got married," Kristen Wilson said, clearly trying to include me in the conversation. "Stanford Hotel Administration program, wasn't it?" A flicker of annoyance crossed Anders' face, quickly replaced by indulgent amusement. "Ancient history now. Celia traded spreadsheets for tablescapes, didn't you, love? Much better suited for her talents." I met Crystal Wilson's gaze briefly, noting the slight furrow in her brow. Unlike her husband, she wasn't smiling at Anders. Dismissal. "I still keep up with industry trends," I offered, my voice modulated to sound casual. "Old habits." Ander laughed, the sound just a touch too loud. "My wife thinks reading Hospitality Monthly means she understands the business. Adorable, isn't it?" The Wilson smiles tightened, but Ander didn't notice. He never did. In 8 years of marriage, my husband had developed a remarkable ability to see exactly what he expected to see and nothing more. And what he expected to see was a decorative wife whose Stanford degree and 5 years in hotel operations were nothing more than an interesting backstory, long since superseded by her more natural role as Mrs. Ander Montgomery. "If you'll excuse me," I said, maintaining my careful smile. "I should check on the silent auction items. I helped organize the charity component tonight." "Always the perfect hostess," Ander said proudly, as though my coordination of a fundraiser that would generate over $2 million for hospitality education scholarships was equivalent to arranging flowers for a dinner party. As I moved through the crowd, I noted Samson Rivera by the seafood display, deep in conversation with Blake Forrester. The two men controlled significant investment portfolios, and I knew from the quarterly reports that both had recently increased their positions in Montgomery Luxury Properties. What I knew, and Ander didn't, was that both were also early angel investors in Artemis Hospitality Group, my hospitality group. I caught Samson's eye, and he gave me a nearly imperceptible nod. Tonight wasn't the time. 6 more weeks of careful positioning, and everything would be ready. In the relative quiet of the auction display area, I checked my second phone, the one Ander knew nothing about. 3 messages from Alexis Gardner, my CFO. Warner financing confirmed. $120 million secured. Dubai team reports acquisition target undervalued by at least 15%. Moving forward as discussed. Call me when you can. Need sign-off on Meridian proposal. I deleted the messages and slipped the phone back into the hidden pocket of my gown. Meridian Investments, Jeffrey Wilson's company and, not coincidentally, the primary financing partner behind Montgomery Luxury Properties' ambitious Asian expansion. The expansion that Ander had leveraged everything to pursue, convinced it would cement his legacy as a visionary in the luxury hospitality space. What my husband didn't know was that I had spent the last 6 years building relationships with every significant player in his business ecosystem, not as Celia Montgomery, wife of hotel magnate Ander Montgomery, but as C.E. Adams, the deliberately low-profile founder of Artemis Hospitality Group, a company that had strategically acquired boutique properties across 3 continents, renovated them with meticulous attention to detail, and established a reputation for extraordinary guest experiences and industry-leading profit margins. I'd chosen the name Artemis deliberately, the goddess who moved invisibly through the world of men, observing everything while remaining unseen herself. It seemed fitting. There you are. I turned to find Ashley Bennett, my personal assistant at Artemis, and officially, my charity event planner, as far as Ander knew. "The Wilsons are looking for you," she said quietly. "Mrs. Wilson specifically. She asked if you had time for a private word." Interesting. Crystal Wilson rarely sought me out at these events. As the wife of Ander's primary investor, she typically followed the same unwritten rules that governed all the hospitality wives: focus on social niceties, avoid serious business discussions, and never, ever outshine your husband. "Tell her I'll meet her in the terrace lounge in 5 minutes," I replied. Ashley nodded and disappeared into the crowd with the efficient grace that made her invaluable. On paper, she coordinated my social calendar and charity work. In reality, she functioned as my deputy at Artemis, handling everything from investor relations to crisis management with equal skill. I made my way to the terrace lounge, a smaller space off the main ballroom where couches and privacy screens created conversation nooks. Crystal was already there, 2 glasses of sparkling water on the table before her. "Celia," she said, rising to greet me. "Thank you for making time." "Of course," I replied, taking the seat opposite her. "Is everything all right?" Crystal glanced around to ensure we were truly private before leaning forward. "I thought you should know. Jeff is concerned about Ander's expansion strategy. The numbers from the Singapore property aren't matching projections, and the Bangkok acquisition seems to be running significantly over budget." I kept my expression neutral despite the confirmation of what my own analysts had already discovered. "I'm sure Ander has contingency plans in place." "That's just it," Crystal said, her voice lowered further. "Jeff doesn't think he does. When questioned, Ander becomes defensive, insists everything is on track." She hesitated. "Jeff has always believed in Ander's vision, but the board is asking questions he can't answer." "Why are you telling me this?" I asked, though I had my suspicions. Crystal held my gaze. "Because unlike my husband, I remember exactly who you were. Before you became Mrs. Montgomery, Stanford's top hotel administration graduate, the youngest operations director ever appointed at the Waldom Group, the analyst who predicted the boutique hotel renaissance 2 years before it happened." I said nothing, waiting. "And," Crystal continued, "because I've been watching Artemis Hospitality Group with great interest. The industry can't stop talking about their management approach and profit margins. Fascinating that a company so successful maintains such a low-profile founder. Almost as if C.E. Adams prefers to be underestimated." Our eyes locked in silent understanding. I'd always known Crystal Wilson was observant, but I hadn't realized she'd made the connection. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. After a moment, I allowed my professional smile to transform into something more genuine. Hypothetically, I said carefully, if someone were building a hospitality company in parallel to her husband's, while he remained completely unaware, what would you think of that? Crystal's lips curved into a small smile. Hypothetically, I'd think that person must be extraordinarily patient, and perhaps married to someone extraordinarily unobservant. Or perhaps, I suggested, married to someone who sees exactly what he expects to see, and nothing more. Crystal nodded slowly. Jeff mentioned that Meridian is considering restructuring their investment in Montgomery properties, given the current concerns. Translation. Meridian was preparing to pull their financing, which would leave Anders' expansion plans and possibly his entire company in jeopardy. That would be unfortunate timing with the Asian properties midway through development, I observed. Yes, Crystal agreed. Though I understand Artemis has recently secured significant new funding. Hypothetically, they might be in a position to acquire distressed luxury properties, should any become available in the near future. Our conversation was interrupted by the arrival of Ander himself, slightly flushed from what I guessed was his third scotch of the evening. There you are, Celia. I've been looking everywhere, he said, barely acknowledging Crystal's presence. The Barrett Smiths want to discuss hosting their daughter's wedding at our Malibu property. I told them you'd handle all the details. He turned to Crystal with a broad smile. My Celia has a real talent for planning these society events. Never met a woman who could coordinate a floral arrangement and 5-course menu like she can. I rose smoothly, noting the flicker of dismay on Crystal's face at Anders' dismissive tone. Crystal and I were just discussing the silent auction, I said. The scholarship fund should exceed our target this year. Wonderful, wonderful, Anders said distractedly. Now, about the Barrett Smiths. Actually, Ander, Crystal interrupted. We were discussing Celia's insights on the boutique luxury market. Her analysis of consumer trends in the sector is quite compelling. Ander laughed, the sound indulgent and condescending. Oh, Crystal, that's very kind of you to humor her. Celia likes to think she keeps up with the industry, but between us, her understanding doesn't extend much beyond thread counts and lobby aesthetics. He placed his hand on my lower back, the pressure slightly firmer than necessary. Isn't that right, darling? Leave the business to the businessmen. I caught Crystal's eye over his shoulder, seeing in her expression the same thing I felt, the perfect mixture of indignation and opportunity. Because every time Ander dismissed me, he reinforced his own blindness. And in 6 short weeks, that blindness would cost him everything he'd built. Of course, dear, I said, my professional smile firmly back in place. Whatever you think best. Thuo, Barrett Smiths turned out to be exactly as Ander had described them. Nouveau riche with aspirations to old money credibility. The kind of clients who believed a 6-figure wedding at a Montgomery luxury property would somehow erase the fact that their fortune came from discount tire centers. As I guided them through a discussion of their daughter's vision, I couldn't help but note the irony. Here was Ander, entrusting me to handle a $300,000 event contract because I was so good with these things, while simultaneously believing I couldn't possibly understand the business implications of the transaction. The Malibu property has the best sunset views on the coast, I explained, showing them photographs on my tablet. If you're planning a June wedding, I'd recommend a ceremony timed for golden hour, followed by dinner on the lower terrace. So, Barrett Smith nodded eagerly. That sounds perfect. Don't you think so, Charles? Before Mr. Barrett Smith could respond, Ander materialized at our table, placing his hand possessively on my shoulder. How are we doing here? He asked, his voice carrying that particular tone of exaggerated enthusiasm he used with potential clients. Has my wife convinced you that Montgomery Luxury is the only choice for Brittany's special day? We were just discussing the Malibu property, I said smoothly. The Barrett Smiths are considering a June date. Excellent, excellent, Anders said, pulling up a chair. You know, the Malibu property was my brainchild. When we acquired it 3 years ago, everyone said the location was too remote to command premium rates. Now it's our highest revenue per room property in North America. He leaned toward Mr. Barrett Smith conspiratorially. Sometimes you have to ignore the experts and trust your instincts. Isn't that right, darling? The last part was directed at me, accompanied by a wink meant to be affectionate but landed as condescending. I maintained my professional smile, knowing what was coming next. You'll have to forgive my wife if she gets too caught up in the details, Ander continued. Celia has an eye for color schemes and menu planning, but she sometimes misses the bigger picture. That's why we make such a good team. She handles the pretty things. I handle the bottom line. Mrs. Barrett Smith tittered nervously while her husband looked uncomfortable. They weren't alone. I'd noted over the years that Anders' dismissive commentary about my capabilities often created awkward moments with clients and colleagues. Not that he ever noticed. What Ander also failed to notice was that the Malibu property had been a distressed asset when Montgomery Luxury acquired it, available at a discount precisely because industry analysts questioned its viability as a premium destination. Brainchild he now claimed credit for had actually been my suggestion, whispered in the ear of a board member who subsequently proposed it as if it were his own idea. Through that indirect route, Ander had discovered the opportunity I'd identified. If you'll excuse me, I said, rising gracefully. I need to check on the auction results. Ander can walk you through the contract details. Ander immediately launched into his standard monologue about Montgomery Luxury's bespoke wedding experiences, already forgetting my presence before I'd fully left the table. As I made my way through the ballroom, I caught Alexis Gardner's eye across the room. My CFO nodded subtly toward the exit, indicating she needed to speak privately. I found her in the quiet hallway leading to the hotel's business center, tablet in hand and expression serious. The Wilson situation is accelerating, she said without preamble. Meridian's board has scheduled an emergency meeting for Tuesday. Our sources say they're voting on whether to pull financing from Montgomery's Asia expansion. Sooner than we expected, I noted. Any idea what triggered this? Alexis swiped through several screens on her tablet. The Singapore property renovations are 38% over budget, and the Bangkok land acquisition has hit regulatory snags. But the real issue seems to be the Dubai numbers. She showed me the financial report, and I felt a chill despite having suspected something like this for months. The Dubai property, Anders' crown jewel and the project he'd leveraged heavily to secure financing for his entire Asian expansion, was reporting occupancy rates that simply didn't align with actual bookings. Someone's manipulating the numbers? I said, studying the discrepancies. It looks like it, Alexis agreed. Either Ander knows and is deliberately misleading investors, or he doesn't know and his finance team is keeping him in the dark, I finished. Either way, when Meridian discovers this, they'll pull out completely. Which means we need to accelerate our timeline, Alexis said. The Artemis board is ready. We can have the financing structure in place within 2 weeks instead of 6. Considered the implications. For nearly 6 years, I'd been patiently building Artemis as a separate entity from Montgomery Luxury. Originally, I'd envisioned a gradual reveal, Ander discovering my company's existence and being forced to acknowledge my business acumen, perhaps even leading to a genuine partnership between equals. But as the years passed and his dismissive attitude calcified into unshakable conviction, I'd recognized that no revelation would change how he saw me. Ander would always find a way to diminish my accomplishments, to frame my success as somehow less significant than his own. And so my strategy had evolved, from seeking recognition to preparing for opportunity. The opportunity that now appeared to be arriving ahead of schedule. How much exposure do we have to Montgomery's potential collapse? I asked. Minimal, Alexis assured me. The investments we made through shell companies are structured to convert to secured debt if Montgomery defaults. In fact, a default would actually strengthen our position for acquisition. I nodded. Decision made. Move forward with the accelerated timeline. And Alexis, make sure our offer to Meridian emphasizes stability and reputation management. Jeffrey Wilson will be looking for a way to extract his company from this situation, without appearing to have missed the warning signs. Already drafted, she confirmed with a slight smile. Crystal Wilson has been quite helpful in suggesting language that would appeal to her husband's concerns. I raised an eyebrow. Crystal has been more directly involved than I realized. Let's just say she's been quietly supportive of women-led businesses for some time, Alexis replied. Her foundation has backed several female entrepreneurs, all through carefully structured vehicles that don't attract attention. The pieces clicked into place. Crystal's pointed comments earlier, her awareness of Artemis, her willingness to provide insight into Meridian's thinking. She wasn't just an ally of convenience. She'd been watching and supporting from the shadows, all along. Interesting, I murmured. Set up a private lunch for the three of us next week. If we're accelerating the timeline, we'll need to coordinate more directly. Before Alexis could respond, the hallway door opened, and Ander appeared with Stephen Parker, Montgomery Luxury's chief financial officer. Celia, there you are, Ander said, his tone slightly sharp. The auction winners are looking for you. They want photos for their social media. He barely glanced at Alexis, dismissing her as unimportant. And who is this? Alexis Gardner, I said smoothly. My event coordinator for the Scholarship Foundation. We were just discussing the final fundraising total. Ander nodded absently, already turning his attention to more important matters. Stephen and I need to use the business center for a moment. Apparently there's some confusion about the Singapore property projections that simply can't wait until Monday. He sighed dramatically. The trials of international expansion. Never a moment's rest, even during a gala. I noted the tension in Stephen's posture, the slight sheen of sweat at his temples despite the cool temperature of the hallway. The CFO knew something was wrong with the numbers. The question was whether he was the one manipulating them or merely the one who had discovered the manipulation. Of course, I said. I'll handle the auction winners. Will you be rejoining the main event after your meeting? Yes, Ander said impatiently. The Wilsons want to discuss next steps for the Bangkok property. Jeffrey seems concerned about some regulatory nonsense, but I'll set him straight. These international bureaucrats just need to understand how the game is played. I exchanged a glance with Alexis, both of us recognizing the implications of Ander's cavalier attitude toward international regulations. Another red flag that Meridian would not be pleased to discover. Don't keep the Wilsons waiting too long, I suggested. Jeffrey mentioned they have an early flight tomorrow. Yes, fine, Ander replied distractedly, already ushering Stephen toward the business center. Oh, and darling, when you speak with the auction winners, try to steer the conversation away from business matters. You know how you sometimes get confused about the details. The business center door closed behind them, leaving Alexis and me alone in the hallway once more. Does he always speak to you that way? Alexis asked quietly. Only when he's worried, I replied, noting the subtle signs of stress in Ander's behavior, and only in public. When we're alone, he doesn't talk about business at all. In his mind, I'm so far removed from that world that it wouldn't even occur to him to discuss it with me. His blind spot, Alexis observed. His fatal flaw, I corrected. Accelerate everything. I want provisional term sheets ready by Wednesday. When Meridian pulls out, Montgomery Luxury will have exactly 72 hours before the news hits the trades. We'll make our move in that window. Alexis nodded, a slow smile spreading across her face. After 6 years in the shadows, Artemis Hospitality is about to step into the light. And Montgomery Luxury is about to discover what happens when you Dismiss someone as just a wife, I added, allowing myself one moment of anticipation before returning to the perfect, professional smile I'd spent years perfecting. It was time to congratulate the auction winners and assure them their generosity would help the next generation of hospitality professionals. Maybe even some young women who, like me, would learn to use others' underestimation as their greatest competitive advantage. The house was quiet when we returned from the gala. Ander had insisted on an additional stop, drinks with the Forrester group at the Skyline Lounge, where he'd consumed 2 more scotches while explaining his visionary expansion strategy to increasingly uncomfortable investors. By the time our driver pulled into the circular driveway of our Bel Air estate, Ander was halfway to unconscious, his speech slurred and his confident demeanor deteriorating into belligerence. Need to call Stephen, he mumbled as I helped him from the car. Singapore numbers don't make sense. In the morning, I said, guiding him up the marble steps. It's after midnight. You don't understand, he insisted, leaning heavily against me. Business, complicated, numbers, very important. I'm sure it is, I replied automatically, the practiced response of years. Agree, soothe, never challenge, especially when he was in this state. Our housekeeper, Maria, appeared in the doorway, concern evident in her expression. She'd been with us since we married, and she'd seen this scenario play out countless times before. I'll take him upstairs, she said quietly. I nodded gratefully. Thank you, Maria. I need to handle a few things in the study. Ander was already being led away, still mumbling about Singapore and projections, when he suddenly turned back toward me, his expression surprisingly lucid for a moment. You looked beautiful tonight, he said. The perfect wife for a man in my position. Then he was gone, guided up the sweeping staircase by Maria's practiced hand. I watched until they disappeared, wondering if he'd ever understand the irony of his words, that being the perfect wife in his eyes had provided the perfect cover for building a company that would soon acquire his. I waited 15 minutes to ensure Ander was settled, then made my way to my private study. Unlike the grand mahogany-paneled office where Ander occasionally brought colleagues for drinks and cigars, my study was a smaller room adjacent to the library, ostensibly designed for managing household accounts and correspondence. The space was deliberately understated, feminine without being frilly, elegant without being imposing. The kind of room visitors would glance at and immediately categorize as a ladies' study, where no serious business could possibly occur, which made it the perfect command center for Artemis Hospitality Group. I unlocked the antique desk's hidden compartment and removed a slim laptop, not the MacBook Air that Ander had given me for keeping track of your charity work, but a high-performance machine with encrypted connections to Artemis servers. Within moments, I was reviewing the documents Alexis had prepared following our conversation at the gala. The financial analysis of Montgomery Luxury's position was even worse than I'd anticipated. The company had leveraged its domestic properties to finance the Asian expansion, using the inflated performance projections from the Dubai property to secure favorable terms. When, those projections were revealed to be fabricated, not only would new financing disappear, but existing loans would likely be called due immediately. My phone vibrated with an incoming call, the secure line, not my regular number. Crystal Wilson. I assume you've seen the numbers, she said when I answered. No preamble necessary. Just reviewing them now, I confirmed. It's worse than we thought. Jeff is furious, Crystal said, her voice tight. He met with Stephen Parker, privately after you left. The Singapore reports were deliberately altered before being presented to the Meridian board. When Jeff confronted Ander about it, he claimed ignorance, blamed it on overzealous junior analysts trying to impress the executive team. I sighed, unsurprised, but still disappointed. Does Ander know the extent of the problem? That's the thing, Crystal replied, frustration evident in her tone. I'm not sure he does. When Jeff pressed him about the regulatory issues in Bangkok and the construction overruns in Singapore, Ander kept insisting everything was under control. Not like he was lying, but like he genuinely believed it. I considered this as I scrolled through the financial reports. It fit with patterns I'd observed over the years. Ander's tendency to dismiss problems, to believe his vision would somehow overcome practical obstacles through sheer force of will. He surrounded himself with people who reinforced this belief, who massaged numbers and hid complications until they became too significant to conceal. The Meridian board vote is being moved up, Crystal continued. Tomorrow afternoon instead of Tuesday. Jeff couldn't stall any longer once the Singapore discrepancies came to light. This accelerated our timeline even further. How certain are you of the outcome? 100%, Crystal said firmly. Meridian is pulling all financing effective, immediately. They're issuing a press release Monday morning. I checked the calendar. That gives us less than 36 hours before the markets open and the news breaks. Jeff is worried about fallout, Crystal added. Not just financial, but reputational. Meridian has backed Montgomery luxury properties for over a decade. Questions will be asked about why they didn't spot the issues sooner. Which makes them the perfect first call for Artemis, I noted. We can position the acquisition as a stability measure, protecting the properties, preserving jobs, maintaining service standards for existing clients. Exactly what Jeff needs to hear, Crystal agreed. How quickly can you move? I closed the financial reports and opened a new document. Contingency plans I'd developed years ago, updated regularly as circumstances evolved. By the time Meridian issues their press release, we'll have term sheets ready for both Meridian and Montgomery Luxury's board. Clean, straightforward, minimal disruption. And Ander? What will this mean for him personally? I paused, considering the question. Despite everything, it wasn't revenge I sought, at least, not entirely. The company will collapse, but the prenuptial agreement protects our personal assets. He won't be destitute, just humbled. Crystal was quiet for a moment. And what about you? Are you prepared for your identity as C.E. Adams to become public knowledge? For Ander to learn the truth after all these years? It was the question I'd asked myself countless times over the past 6 years. In the beginning, I'd kept my involvement with Artemis secret out of practical necessity. Ander would have seen a separate career as competition for my attention, an unwelcome distraction from my real purpose as his wife. Over time, as Artemis grew and I recognized the strategic advantage of anonymity, the secret had evolved into something more complicated. Yes, I said finally. It's time. After ending the call with Crystal, I spent another hour reviewing documents and sending encrypted instructions to my executive team. By the time I finally closed the laptop and returned it to its hiding place, the first light of dawn was beginning to filter through the windows. I made my way upstairs to the master suite, where Ander lay sprawled across our king-size bed, still in his tuxedo trousers and undershirt. In sleep, his face relaxed from its usual expression of confident certainty. He looked younger, almost vulnerable. I allowed myself a moment of reflection, remembering why I'd fallen in love with him 10 years earlier. His ambition, his charisma, his absolute conviction that he could achieve whatever he set his mind to. Those same qualities had eventually created the gulf between us. Ambition became arrogance, charisma turned to condescension, conviction hardened into inflexibility. The man who had once found my intelligence and drive appealing had gradually reshaped me in his mind, casting me as a supporting character in his success story rather than the co-author of our shared narrative. And I had allowed it, encouraged it even, creating the perfect camouflage for building something he couldn't diminish or control. I changed quietly into silk pajamas and slipped into bed beside him, careful not to disturb his whiskey-induced slumber. In less than 48 hours, everything would change. The Montgomery luxury empire would begin to crumble, and Artemis Hospitality would emerge from the shadows to acquire its assets. The business world would buzz with the revelation that C.E. Adams, the mysterious founder whose innovative approach to luxury hospitality had generated industry-leading returns, was actually Celia Montgomery, the decorative wife who supposedly couldn't understand complex financial projections. And Ander would finally see me, truly see me, for the first time in years. As I drifted toward sleep, I wondered if that recognition would bring satisfaction, or simply sadness for what might have been if he'd been able to view me as a partner rather than a possession. Perhaps both. My last conscious thought before sleep claimed me was not of triumph or revenge, but of a simple truth I'd learned during my years of invisible empire building. Sometimes being underestimated is the greatest advantage of all. Sometimes being dismissed as just a wife provides the perfect cover for becoming so much more. Morning arrived with the oppressive weight of Anders' hangover and the relentless ping of his phone receiving message after message. I was already showered and dressed when he finally stirred, groaning as consciousness brought the full impact of the previous night's excesses. "What time is it?" he mumbled, shielding his eyes from the sunlight filtering through the automated blinds. "Just after 9, I replied, setting a glass of water and 2 aspirin on his nightstand. "You have 14 missed calls, mostly from Stephen." Ander grabbed his phone, squinting at the screen. "Damn it," he muttered, immediately hitting the callback button. I moved toward the door, giving him privacy for what was clearly an urgent business matter, but his next words froze me in place. "Stephen, slow down," he said, voice still rough with sleep. "What do you mean discrepancies? Those projections were vetted by the entire finance team." I paused, watching as Anders' expression shifted from confusion to disbelief. "That's impossible," he insisted. "The Dubai property is performing exactly as forecasted. I saw the reports myself last quarter." Another pause as he listened, his face draining of color. "Emergency board meeting? Today? No, you're overreacting. Call Wilson. Tell him it's a simple misunderstanding. We'll clarify the numbers tomorrow." As Ander continued his increasingly desperate conversation, I slipped quietly from the room, my mind already shifting to the cascade of events now set in motion. By this time tomorrow, the carefully constructed facade of Montgomery Luxury's expansion would begin to crack. By the end of the week, the company Ander had spent 15 years building would be on the verge of collapse, and Artemis Hospitality, my company, would be perfectly positioned to acquire the pieces. Ander moved through the house like a man possessed, barking orders into his phone while frantically gathering documents. His typical Sunday routine, leisurely brunch, perhaps a round of golf at the country club, had been abandoned in favor of crisis management. "I need everyone at the office in 1 hour," he snapped to someone on the other end of the call. "Everyone, Stephen. I don't care if it's Sunday. Cancel whatever brunches or tennis matches or whatever the hell else. This is an emergency." I busied myself in the kitchen, preparing a light breakfast. He wouldn't eat, and coffee he would gulp down without tasting. The routine was familiar from previous crises, though none had carried the weight of this one. "Celia," he called, appearing in the doorway with his tie askew and hair still damp from his rushed shower. "I need to go into the office. Emergency situation." "Of course," I replied, sliding a travel mug of coffee across the counter. "Anything I can do to help?" He laughed, a short, distracted sound with an edge of hysteria. "Unless you've suddenly become an expert in international hotel financing, probably not." He grabbed the coffee, barely glancing at me. "There's some confusion with our Asian expansion numbers. Nothing serious, just bureaucratic nonsense that needs sorting." The lie came easily to him. Whether to protect me or himself, I couldn't be sure. Perhaps both. "Should I cancel our dinner with the Parkers tonight?" I asked, already knowing the answer. Yes," he said distractedly, checking his watch. "Make my apologies. Say I've come down with something. Nothing serious, just indisposed." Of course, I repeated, the dutiful wife managing social obligations while her husband handled important matters. He paused at the door, seeming to remember something. Oh, and I might be late tonight. Don't wait up. With that, he was gone. The sound of his sports car's engine revving aggressively as he tore down the driveway. I waited until the sound faded before reaching for my own phone. Not my regular iPhone, but the secure device I used for Artemis business. He's on his way to the office, I told Alexis when she answered. Gathering the executive team for an emergency meeting? We know, she replied. Blake just called. He's been summoned as part of the investor group. Ander is trying to secure emergency bridge financing to cover the Singapore overruns. Will he succeed? I asked, though I already knew the answer. Not a chance, Alexis said confidently. Our team has been quietly speaking with all potential sources. No one's willing to throw good money after bad, especially with the Meridian. Vote happening today. I moved to my study, closing the door before continuing. What's our status? Term sheets are ready, Alexis confirmed. Legal has prepared 3 scenarios based on how the board responds. The moment Meridian announces they're pulling out, we'll be ready to move. And the identity issue? I asked, referring to the imminent revelation that C.E. Adams and Celia Montgomery were one and the same. PR has prepared statements for all major publications. We're positioning it as a strategic decision to operate independently rather than as a direct response to Anders' dismissal. More professional, less personal. I appreciated the approach. While part of me wanted the satisfaction of seeing Ander forced to acknowledge his misjudgment, the business needed to be protected from appearing as a vehicle for marital drama. What about our people inside Montgomery? I asked. They'll maintain their positions through the transition, Alexis assured me. Blake will broker the initial conversation with the board once Meridian pulls out. Most of the directors already suspect trouble. They just don't know there's a solution waiting in the wings. I ended the call and spent the next hour reviewing financial projections and acquisition scenarios. Unlike Anders' frantic scramble to salvage his overextended expansion, my preparation had been methodical, developed over years rather than hours. By the time I changed into a simple but elegant suit, appropriate for the meetings that would soon be necessary, I felt a strange calm. The storm was breaking, but I had built my shelter long ago. My phone buzzed with a text from Crystal Wilson. Board vote complete. Unanimous decision to terminate all financing. Jeff making calls now. I checked the time. 1:42 p.m. Earlier than expected. The dominoes would begin falling immediately. As if on cue, my regular phone lit up with Anders' name. I let it ring twice before answering, composing my expression even though he couldn't see me. Hello? Celia. His voice was tight, controlled but with an undercurrent of panic. I need you to do something for me. Of course, I said, maintaining the supportive wife role one last time. What do you need? The Barrett Smiths, the wedding clients from last night. Call them and secure the contract. Today. We need the deposit. I frowned, genuinely confused. Ander, that's a single event. Contract. It's substantial, but nothing that would impact the company's overall position. Silence hung for a moment before he responded, his voice now edged with irritation. Just make the call, Celia. We need every bit of cash flow right now. Don't worry about why. Is everything all right? I asked, already knowing the answer but needing to maintain my pretense of ignorance. Everything's fine, he snapped. Just some temporary liquidity issues. Nothing for you to worry about. Should I call the bank? I could transfer funds from our personal accounts to help with— No. The word exploded with such force I had to hold the phone away from my ear. Don't touch our personal accounts. Don't talk to the bank. Just call the Barrett Smiths and get that contract signed. After he hung up, I stood motionless for several moments, contemplating the desperation in his voice. The Montgomery luxury empire was crumbling faster than even I had anticipated. Ander was grasping at straws. A wedding contract worth a few $100,000 when his company needed tens of millions to stay afloat. My phone buzzed again, this time with a message from Blake Forrester. Montgomery Board emergency meeting called. For 4 p.m. Meridian announcement expected at market open tomorrow. We're ready to move when you give the word. I sent a simple reply. Proceed as planned. Then I made another call. Not to the Barrett Smiths, but to Ashley. I need the car in 20 minutes, I told my assistant. And I'll need access to the Artemis executive suite. It's time. For 6 years, I had maintained a careful separation between my identities. Celia Montgomery, the decorative wife who managed social calendars and charity events, never visited the downtown offices of Artemis Hospitality Group. C.E. Adams, the reclusive founder who communicated primarily through trusted lieutenants, never attended the social functions where Celia Montgomery shone. Today, those identities would merge. As my driver navigated through Sunday afternoon traffic toward downtown, I reviewed the series of events that would unfold over the next 24 hours. By tomorrow morning, Meridian would announce its withdrawal from all Montgomery luxury projects. By noon, Montgomery's stock would be in free fall. By close of business, the board would be desperately seeking options to avoid complete collapse. And Artemis Hospitality Group, under the leadership of newly revealed CEO Celia Adams Montgomery, would offer a lifeline, structured as an acquisition, rather than a rescue, but positioned to preserve jobs, maintain service at the properties, and provide some return to shareholders. My phone buzzed continuously throughout the drive, Ander calling repeatedly, growing increasingly frantic as the reality of his situation became clearer. I let the calls go to voicemail, knowing there was nothing I could say that would matter now. The time for pretense had passed. The Artemis headquarters occupied the top 3 floors of a sleek downtown tower, modern, elegant, but deliberately understated compared to the ostentatious Montgomery luxury offices with their marble lobbies and gold fixtures. I used my private access, avoiding the main reception area where my appearance might raise questions before we were ready for the reveal. Alexis met me in the executive suite, tablet in hand and expression focused. Blake just texted. The Montgomery board meeting has been moved up to 3 p.m. They've received formal notification from Meridian. How's Ander taking it? I asked, setting down my bag and moving to the window that offered a view of the city skyline, including, several blocks away, the Montgomery luxury building where my husband was watching his company disintegrate. Not well, Alexis said diplomatically. Blake says he's cycling between denial and rage, insisting the numbers are wrong, that Meridian is making a terrible mistake, that his team has failed him. But not considering that he might have failed them, I noted. It was consistent with Ander's character. Success was his achievement alone. Failure always someone else's responsibility. The acquisition team is ready, Alexis continued, professional as always. Term sheets, financing structure, transition plans, everything is prepared. We're just waiting on your final review. I turned from the window to face the conference table where the future of both companies lay in neatly organized folders. 6 years of planning, of patient strategy and careful positioning, condensed into documents that would transform the luxury hospitality landscape. Walk me through it one more time, I said, taking a seat at the head of the table. I want to be certain we've considered every angle. For the next hour, Alexis and I reviewed the acquisition strategy in meticulous detail. The approach was clean, business-focused, and deliberately devoid of personal elements. Artemis would acquire Montgomery Luxury's assets at a fair market value, retain the majority of staff, honor existing client contracts, and stabilize the Asian properties that had been mismanaged during the expansion. The personal satisfaction of seeing Ander finally recognize my capabilities was secondary to ensuring the business transition succeeded. As we concluded our review, my phone lit up with another call from Ander. This time, I answered. Celia, where are you? His voice was ragged. desperate in a way I'd never heard before. "I've been calling for hours." "I had some errands to run," I said calmly. "Is everything all right?" A harsh laugh came through the line. "No, everything is not all right. Everything is falling apart. Meridian has pulled all financing. The board is in panic mode. The Dubai numbers were—" He stopped abruptly, seeming to remember who he was talking to. "Never mind. I need you to come home. I need to figure out what to tell our friends, how to manage the social fallout when this hits the news." Even now, in the midst of professional catastrophe, his concern about my role focused on appearances and social dynamics. The perfect wife to manage the optics while he handled the real issues. "I'm afraid I can't come home just yet," I said. "I have a meeting." "A meeting?" His voice rose incredulously. "Celia, I don't think you understand the severity of what's happening. Whatever charity luncheon or fundraiser you're planning can—" "Wait! It's not a charity meeting, Ander," I replied, my tone remaining steady. "It's a board meeting at Artemis Hospitality Group." The silence that followed stretched for several seconds. "Artemis, the company that's been acquiring boutique properties all over the world?" He sounded genuinely confused. "What does that have to do with you?" "Everything," I said simply. "I founded it 6 years ago. I'm the CEO, and tomorrow we'll be making an offer to acquire the assets of Montgomery Luxury Properties." The silence returned, longer this time, broken only by the sound of his breathing. "That's not funny, Celia," he finally said, his voice dangerously quiet. "It's not meant to be," I replied. "I'll see you at home tonight. We have a lot to discuss." I ended the call before he could respond, turning back to Alexis, who had witnessed the exchange with professional restraint. "It's done," I said. "Alert the team. We move forward first thing tomorrow morning." The storm had broken, and everything was about to change. The house was dark when I arrived home, save for a single light burning in Anders' study. I found him there, slumped in his leather chair, an empty glass in one hand, and a half-empty bottle of scotch on the desk before him. The man who had left that morning, harried but still commanding, still certain of his ability to solve any crisis, had been replaced by someone I barely recognized. His normally impeccable appearance had disintegrated, tie loosened, shirt wrinkled, hair disheveled from repeatedly running his hands through it. He didn't look up when I entered, though he must have heard me. For a long moment, the only sound was the gentle ticking of the antique clock on the mantel, a wedding gift from his parents, a reminder of the Montgomery legacy he had been so determined to enhance. "Is it true?" he finally asked, voice hoarse. I set down my bag and moved to the chair opposite his desk, smoothing my skirt as I sat, a habitual gesture from countless business meetings. "Yes," I said simply. He looked up then, his eyes bloodshot, but lucid. "How long?" "I founded Artemis 6 years ago." "6 years," he repeated, a bitter smile twisting his lips. "6 years of lying to my face." "I never lied," I corrected calmly. "You never asked. You never showed any interest in what I did with my time, as long as I was available when you needed a hostess or a social secretary." "Don't put this on me," he snapped, anger briefly overtaking his exhaustion. "You deliberately hid this. You operated a competing business behind my back." "Not competing," I said. "Different market segments, different investment strategies, different management approaches. Montgomery Luxury and Artemis Hospitality have only begun to overlap recently." He laughed, a harsh sound devoid of humor. "Overlapped? Is that what you call this? You're trying to take over my company." "I'm offering to acquire Montgomery Luxury's assets at fair market value," I corrected, "which, given Meridian's withdrawal and the Dubai numbers, is significantly more generous than any other offer you're likely to receive." Anders stared at me as if seeing a stranger. Perhaps he was. "Who are you?" he whispered. "The same person I've always been," I replied. The Stanford graduate who caught your eye at the International Hotel Investment Conference. The operations specialist who had 3 promotions in 5 years at Waldom Group. The woman who suggested the Malibu property acquisition that became your highest performing domestic asset. I leaned forward, holding his gaze. I'm the wife who listened when you mocked my business acumen at dinner parties. The wife who watched you take credit for my ideas because you couldn't imagine they had originated with me. The wife who finally realized that no matter what I achieved, you would only ever see me as an extension of yourself, a decorative accessory rather than a partner. Something flickered in his eyes, confusion, perhaps, or the first glimmer of recognition. So, this is revenge? You built a company just to destroy mine? No, Ander, I said with a sigh. I built a company because I'm good at building companies. I kept it separate from our marriage because you made it abundantly clear you didn't want a wife with ambitions that might compete with yours. And I'm acquiring Montgomery Luxury because it's a sound business decision for Artemis shareholders. Nothing more, nothing less. He drained his glass and reached for the bottle, pouring another generous measure. You must have enjoyed it, he said, bitterness edging his words. Sitting there at all those dinners, listening to me talk about the business while you secretly ran your own, laughing at me behind my back. I never laughed at you, Ander, I said quietly. I admired your vision, your ambition. I still do. But I couldn't respect the way you dismissed mine. He slammed the glass down, scotch sloshing over the rim. Then, why not just leave? Why the elaborate deception for 6 years? It was the question I had asked myself countless times, the answer evolving as both Artemis and our marriage had changed. At first, it was simpler to keep my professional life separate. I explained. You were so resistant to the idea of me working at all, let alone building something independent of you. Later, as Artemis grew, I recognized the strategic advantage of anonymity. The business world treats female CEOs differently, subjects them to additional scrutiny, different standards. As C.E. Adams, I could build without those constraints. And now, he challenged, why reveal yourself now? Because the situation demands it, I replied simply. Montgomery Luxury needs a solution, and Artemis is positioned to provide one. Keeping my identity secret now would create more problems than it solves. Anders studied me, some of his analytical capacities seeming to return despite the scotch. The Wilson connection, he said slowly. Crystal knew, didn't she? That's why Meridian pulled out. They were already planning to back you. Meridian pulled out because your numbers didn't add up, I corrected. The Dubai projections were fabricated, the Singapore overruns concealed, the Bangkok regulatory issues minimized. They would have withdrawn regardless of my involvement. But they knew, he insisted. They knew you were waiting to swoop in and pick up the pieces. I sighed, recognizing that in his current state, Ander needed someone to blame besides himself. Crystal figured it out on her own. She recognized my business approach in Artemis's operations, but Meridian's decision was based on Montgomery Luxury's performance, not on Artemis's acquisition plans. He shook his head, unwilling or unable to accept this explanation. All those years, he muttered. All those business dinners where I brought you along to charm the clients, and you were studying them, planning to steal them. No one is stealing anything, Ander, I said firmly. This is business. Your company expanded too aggressively, leveraged too heavily, and failed to maintain proper controls. Now it's facing the consequences of those decisions. My decisions, he corrected, voice hardening. Say it, Celia. This is my failure. Not entirely, I acknowledged. Your finance team bears responsibility for the misleading projections. Your board should have provided better oversight. Even Meridian should have conducted more thorough due diligence before backing the expansion. I paused, meeting his gaze. Directly. But yes, Ultimately, the culture that allowed this to happen comes from the top. From you. He flinched as if I'd struck him. For a moment, I thought he might lash out. His knuckles whitened around the glass. But then his shoulders sagged, the fight draining from him as suddenly as it had flared. "So what happens now?" he asked, voice hollow. "Tomorrow morning, Meridian, will announce they're terminating all financing for Montgomery luxury properties," I explained, shifting into the calm, professional tone I used in board meetings. "Your stock will likely be halted after dropping below critical thresholds. By midday, your board will be fielding panic calls from other lenders and investors. By close of business, they'll be considering bankruptcy protection to prevent a complete collapse." I reached into my bag and removed a slim folder, placing it on the desk between us. "This contains the preliminary terms of Artemis Hospitality Group's offer to acquire Montgomery Luxury's assets. It's a fair valuation given the circumstances, significantly more generous than what vulture firms would offer once news of the Dubai numbers becomes public." Ander made no move to touch the folder. "And if I fight this? If I convince the board to reject your offer?" "That's your prerogative," I acknowledged. "But without immediate financing to cover the Meridian withdrawal, Montgomery Luxury will default on its loans within 30 days. The Asian properties will stall mid-development, losing value by the day. Domestic properties will face service cuts, staff reductions, and declining guest experiences, further eroding the brand." I leaned forward slightly. "Fighting won't save the company, Ander. It will only destroy more value for everyone involved: shareholders, employees, clients." He reached for the folder then, opening it with unsteady hands. His eyes scanned the terms: professional training temporarily overriding emotional response. "You're keeping the Montgomery name on the domestic properties," he noted, surprise evident in his voice. "It's a strong brand with loyal clients," I confirmed. "Erasing it would be poor business, regardless of personal considerations." "And the staff?" he asked, continuing to read. "Retained, with the exception of certain executive positions that would become redundant in the merged organization." He looked up sharply. "Including mine?" "Yes," I said simply. "Including yours, though the terms include a generous consulting contract if you wish to remain involved during the transition." Ander closed the folder, pushing it away as if the physical distance might somehow change its contents. "So that's it? 8 years of marriage, 15 years building Montgomery Luxury, and it all ends with you taking over while I become a footnote in my own company's history?" "The business outcomes were determined by business decisions," I said, keeping my voice steady. "As for our marriage, that's a separate conversation, one we should probably have when you're sober." He laughed again, that same hollow sound, always so controlled, so rational. Was that real, at least? Or was the perfect, supportive wife just another business strategy? The question stung more than I had expected. "I loved you, Ander," I said quietly. "I still care for you. But I stopped being your partner years ago, if I ever truly was. I became your accessory, you're just a wife. And neither of us seemed to know how to change that dynamic." "Except you did," he pointed out. "You built a company that's now poised to acquire mine. That's quite a change in dynamics." "True," I acknowledged, "though not the one I would have preferred." He rubbed his face tiredly. "What would you have preferred?" "A marriage between equals," I said without hesitation. "A husband who valued my mind as much as my social skills. A partner who didn't feel threatened by my ambitions or dismissive of my capabilities." For a moment, something like regret flickered across his features. "When did I start seeing you that way? As just a wife?" The question seemed genuine, the first hint that he might be capable of self-reflection beneath the anger and humiliation. "It was gradual," I said truthfully. "Small comments at first, harmless-seeming jokes about my business opinions, then more deliberate dismissals when I offered suggestions. Eventually, it became your default, introducing me only in relation to you, explaining to others what I couldn't possibly understand, defining my value entirely through how I enhanced your image. I stood, suddenly weary of the conversation. Review the terms, Ander. Sleep on it. We can discuss the details tomorrow after the Meridian announcement. As I turned to leave, he spoke again, his voice softer than before. Was I really so blind? I paused in the doorway, looking back at the man I had once believed would be my partner in all things. You saw what you expected to see, I said gently. And you never expected your wife to be anything more than just a wife. Monday morning arrived with the clinical precision of long-anticipated consequences. I woke early, after a restless night in the guest bedroom, and dressed with deliberate care, a charcoal suit that projected authority without ostentation, simple pearl earrings that had been my grandmother's, hair pulled back in a sleek chignon. Today, Celia Montgomery would publicly merge with C.E. Adams, and every detail of my appearance had been considered. Ander was already gone when I came downstairs, his absence noted only by an empty coffee mug in the sink, and the faint scent of his cologne lingering in the foyer. I hadn't expected a conversation, not after last night's confrontation, but the silent departure felt symbolic nonetheless. For years, we had orbited each other without truly connecting. Now, even that pretense of shared space had dissolved. My secure phone buzzed as I was leaving. Alexis. Meridian just issued the press release, she said without preamble. Trading in Montgomery luxury stock has been halted after an initial drop of 37% in pre-market activity. And our statement? I asked, sliding into the back seat of the waiting car. Ready to go out at 9:30 after the markets open officially. Blake reports that Montgomery's board has called an emergency session for 10 a.m. He says multiple directors have already contacted him privately, seeking assurance about our offer. I watched the familiar landscape of our neighborhood slide past. The window, the manicured lawns and stately homes that had formed the backdrop of my life as Ander Montgomery's wife. By this evening, that identity would be fundamentally altered, recontextualized in light of revelations about my professional life. Any sign of Ander? I asked. A brief hesitation before Alexis answered. He arrived at Montgomery headquarters about 30 minutes ago. Security reports he went straight to his office and has been making calls since. His assistant says he appears composed. That surprised me. I had expected rage, denial, perhaps even public accusations of betrayal. Composed was not the reaction I had anticipated from a man whose company and marriage were simultaneously imploding. Keep me updated, I said as the car turned onto the freeway toward downtown. I'll be at Artemis within 20 minutes. The Artemis executive suite had transformed overnight from its usual quiet efficiency to a command center humming with activity. PR teams coordinated with financial analysts, transition planners consulted with operations specialists, legal experts reviewed contracts and regulatory filings. At the center of it all stood Alexis, directing the complex choreography with characteristic precision. The Montgomery board meeting has been moved up to 9:30, she informed me as I arrived. They're not waiting for the markets to open. Blake thinks they've already seen enough pre-market activity to understand the severity of the situation. I nodded, surveying the activity around us. And our team is ready? Completely, she confirmed. The moment we receive word from the Montgomery board, we'll issue our statement and activate the acquisition protocol. Transition teams are standing by, and our operations people are prepared to deploy to all Montgomery properties by end of day. The efficiency was impressive, but not surprising. We had been preparing for this scenario, or variations of it, for years, refining the approach as conditions evolved and opportunities emerged. The acceleration of the timeline had required adjustments, but the fundamental strategy remained unchanged. Swift, decisive action that prioritized stability for the properties, clients, and employees. Crystal Wilson is here, Alexis added, gesturing toward a small conference room off the main area. She's brought additional information about Meridian's position that you'll want to review before the public announcements. I found Crystal seated at the conference table, reviewing documents with an intensity that matched the circumstances. She looked up as I entered, her expression a complex mixture of professional satisfaction and personal concern. "Celia," she said, rising to greet me. "Or should I say Ms. Adams now?" "Celia is fine," I replied, taking the seat opposite her. "At least in private conversations. What's Meridian's current position?" She slid a folder across the table. "Jeff has authorized me to share their internal assessment of Montgomery Luxury's financial position. The situation is worse than even your analysts projected. The Dubai numbers weren't just optimistic, they were fabricated outright. And the Singapore property has additional construction issues that weren't disclosed to investors." I scanned the documents, noting the details that would strengthen Artemis's negotiating position. "Does Ander know the full extent of this?" Crystal hesitated. "Jeff spoke with him directly this morning. It was difficult. Ander insisted there must be some mistake, that his team wouldn't have presented incorrect information without his knowledge. And when Jeff made it clear there was no mistake, Ander asked for 24 hours to secure alternative financing," Crystal said, a hint of sympathy in her voice despite the circumstances. "Jeff had to explain that Meridian had already contacted other potential investors. No one is willing to step in, given the extent of the misrepresentation." I closed the folder, contemplating the implications. "So Ander is still fighting, still looking for a way out." "Yes and no," Crystal said carefully. "After the call with Jeff, he apparently gathered his executive team. According to our sources, he instructed them to cooperate fully with any acquisition discussions. He acknowledged that Montgomery Luxury cannot survive independently given the financial realities. This was unexpected. Acceptance rather than resistance. Pragmatism rather than denial. It didn't align with the Ander I knew, the man who had built his identity around his business success and would fight to preserve it at all costs. "Did something specific change his mind?" I asked. Crystal regarded me thoughtfully. "The terms you offered," she said finally. "They're exceptionally fair given the circumstances. Preserving the Montgomery name on the domestic properties, retaining the majority of staff offering participation in the transition. Those weren't requirements. They were choices you made." Before I could respond, Alexis appeared at the door, her expression conveying the urgency of her interruption. "The Montgomery board has voted," she announced. "They've authorized emergency negotiations with Artemis for immediate acquisition of all assets. Blake is bringing the formal acknowledgement now." Crystal and I exchanged a glance of shared understanding. It was happening, the culmination of years of planning, accelerated into a single morning of decisive action. "Issue our statement," I instructed Alexis, "and inform the transition teams to proceed with the initial protocol. I want representatives at each Montgomery property by close of business today." As Alexis departed to implement these directives, Crystal studied me with newfound curiosity. "How does it feel?" she asked. "After all these years of being dismissed as just a wife, to be revealed as the business force that will save the very company that underestimated you?" It was a question I had asked myself repeatedly as this day approached. The answer, I discovered, was more nuanced than I had anticipated. Complicated, I admitted. There's professional satisfaction in the acquisition itself. Artemis is gaining valuable assets at advantageous terms. But the personal element... I paused, searching for the right words. I never wanted Ander to fail. I simply wanted him to see me as a true partner, not an accessory. Crystal nodded, understanding evident in her expression. "And now?" "Now I hope to demonstrate what should have been clear all along, that competence isn't determined by gender or marital status, that just a wife was always a limitation he imposed, not an inherent reality." Our conversation was interrupted by the arrival of Blake Forrester, carrying the formal authorization from Montgomery Luxury's board. His expression conveyed both professional satisfaction and personal awkwardness, understandable, given his long-standing relationships with both me and Ander. "It's done," he said, placing the documents on the table. The board voted unanimously to accept Artemis's initial terms, pending final negotiation of specific details. They've authorized an immediate press release to stabilize market reaction. And Ander? I couldn't help asking. How did he respond to the vote? Blake hesitated, clearly uncomfortable. He endorsed it, he said finally. Made a brief statement to the board acknowledging the necessity of the acquisition given the financial circumstances. Offered his full cooperation in the transition process. Again, this measured acceptance seemed at odds with the Ander I knew. The man who had built his identity around being the visionary leader of Montgomery Luxury. Something had changed between our confrontation last night and this morning's board meeting, but I couldn't identify what. There's something else, Blake added, his discomfort visibly increasing. Ander asked me to give you this. He placed a sealed envelope on the table. Privately, I stared at the envelope, my name written in Ander's distinctive handwriting across the front. The simple object seemed incongruous amidst the corporate documents and financial analyses that surrounded us. A personal communication intersecting with professional consequences. Crystal tactfully rose to leave. I should check in with Jeff about the Meridian announcement. He'll want to coordinate messaging with your team. Blake followed her lead. I need to return to the Montgomery board session. They'll be expecting updates on the transition timeline. Left alone with the envelope, I found myself hesitating to open it. Whatever it contained represented Ander's unfiltered response to the situation. His true reaction, not the composed professional facade he had apparently maintained during the board meeting. Finally, I broke the seal and unfolded the single page inside. Celia, by the time you read this, the Montgomery Luxury Board will have accepted Artemis's acquisition offer. I've endorsed this decision not just because it's financially necessary, but because it's right. The company I built is failing because of choices I made, expansion too aggressive, oversight too lax, confidence too absolute. But my greatest failure wasn't business-related. It was personal. Somewhere along the way, I stopped seeing you as the brilliant, capable woman I married and started viewing you as an extension of myself, a supporting character in the story of my success rather than the author of your own. I don't expect forgiveness. What I've done, dismissing your capabilities, mocking your understanding, reducing you to just a wife, isn't erased by a moment of clarity in the midst of crisis. But I want you to know that I see it now. I see you now. What you've built with Artemis is extraordinary, not because it's acquiring Montgomery, but because you created it methodically, strategically, with vision and persistence. The very qualities I claimed you lacked while you demonstrated them daily. Whatever happens next, with the company, with us, I needed you to know that. Ander, I read the letter twice, searching for the defensiveness or bitterness I had expected. Instead, I found what appeared to be genuine self-reflection. The first acknowledgement from Ander that his perception had been flawed, that the limitation had been in his vision, not my capabilities. It wasn't enough to erase years of dismissal. A single letter couldn't undo the pattern of behavior that had shaped our marriage and ultimately led to this moment of corporate and personal reckoning. But it was something I hadn't anticipated. Recognition, acknowledgement, the beginning of seeing truly. My reflection was interrupted by Alexis's return. The press statement has gone out, she reported. Financial media is already picking up the story. CNBC wants an interview with you at noon to discuss the acquisition and… She paused briefly, to introduce C.E. Adams to the public. I folded the letter carefully, returning it to its envelope before rising to face the day that would transform both Artemis hospitality and my public identity. Schedule the interview, I said. It's time for everyone to see that just a wife was always capable of so much more. And joining us now for an exclusive interview is C.E. Adams, founder and CEO of Artemis Hospitality Group, which has just announced its acquisition of Montgomery Luxury Properties following Meridian Investments' withdrawal of financing. Ms. Adams, thank you for being with us today. The CNBC anchor's professional smile contained the barely concealed excitement of someone with an exclusive story. The revelation that the reclusive C.E. Adams, whose identity had been the subject of industry speculation for years, was actually Celia Montgomery, wife of the very man whose company she was acquiring, had transformed a standard business acquisition into the hospitality story of the year. Thank you for having me, Kristen, I replied, maintaining the composed demeanor I'd cultivated over years of business negotiations. Let's address what everyone is talking about, the anchor continued. You've been operating Artemis Hospitality Group for 6 years under the name C.E. Adams, while married to Andrew Montgomery, founder of Montgomery Luxury Properties. During this time, Mr. Montgomery was frequently quoted describing you as just a wife with limited business understanding. Was this acquisition motivated by those dismissals? The question was direct, as I'd expected. The narrative of revenge, of a dismissed wife proving her value by acquiring her husband's failing company, was too compelling for the media to resist. Artemis Hospitality Group makes acquisition decisions based on business metrics, not personal considerations, I responded. The answer practiced but truthful. Montgomery Luxury Properties owns exceptional assets that align with our portfolio strategy. The current financial circumstances created an opportunity for acquisition at advantageous terms. That's what drove our decision. The anchor nodded, clearly unsatisfied with the corporate response. But surely the personal element played some role. Your husband publicly diminished your business capabilities for years, apparently unaware that you were building a more successful hospitality company than his own. That must have factored into your thinking. I allowed a small, measured smile. I separated my personal and professional lives for business reasons, not personal ones. Operating as C.E. Adams allowed Artemis to develop without the scrutiny or assumptions that often accompany female-led companies. The fact that my husband didn't recognize my involvement was a function of his own perspective, not my strategy. Speaking of your husband, the anchor pressed, how has Andrew Montgomery responded to this revelation? Sources at Montgomery Luxury describe him as shocked, but cooperative regarding the acquisition. This required more careful navigation. The letter Andrew had sent represented a private communication, not something to be shared with national media. Yet the public would expect some insight into his reaction. Andrew has acted professionally throughout this process, I said. He's prioritized the stability of the Montgomery properties and the welfare of their employees, which aligns with Artemis's approach to this acquisition. Beyond that, our personal discussions remain private. The anchor shifted tactics, moving to firmer business ground. Artemis Hospitality has maintained a distinctive management philosophy across its properties: local sourcing, sustainability, initiatives, and what you've called accessible luxury. Will these approaches be implemented at the former Montgomery properties? This was comfortable territory, allowing me to highlight Artemis's business strategy rather than the personal drama. For the next several minutes, I outlined our transition plans, emphasizing continuity for existing clients while gradually introducing the operational efficiencies and service enhancements that had distinguished Artemis properties. One final question, the anchor said as our time neared its end. What would you say to young women watching who might feel underestimated in their professional lives, as you clearly were? It was the question I'd been expecting, the one that transformed this from a business story to something more symbolic. My response had been carefully considered, balancing authenticity with the larger message. Being underestimated can be frustrating, but it can also be advantageous, I said. When people don't expect you to succeed, They don't create obstacles to prevent your success. The key is to focus on results rather than recognition. Build something meaningful. Demonstrate your value through achievement, and eventually the people who matter will see it, even if some never do. As the interview concluded and the cameras stopped rolling, the anchor leaned forward with genuine curiosity. Off the record, was it satisfying? When he finally realized who you really were? I gathered my notes, considering the question. The satisfaction came from building something worthwhile, I said finally. The recognition was secondary. It wasn't entirely true, but it wasn't entirely false either. The complexity of my feelings about Anders' revelation, the mixture of vindication and regret, of professional pride and personal sadness, wasn't something that could be distilled into a soundbite, on or off the record. Back at Artemis headquarters, the energy had shifted from crisis management to implementation. Transition teams were deploying to Montgomery properties worldwide. Operations specialists were reviewing systems integration protocols, and HR representatives were preparing communications for employees at all levels. The interview played well. Alexis reported as I rejoined the command center. Financial analysts are responding positively to the emphasis on business strategy rather than personal drama. Montgomery stock has been unfrozen and is stabilizing around the acquisition price point. And the properties? I asked, focusing on the practical rather than the public relations. Initial reports from our advance teams are promising, she confirmed. Staff at the domestic locations seem relieved rather than resistant. The international properties are more complicated, especially the Asian expansion sites where construction issues have been minimized or concealed. Prioritize transparency, I instructed. I want complete assessments of all properties within 72 hours with no sugarcoating of problems. We'll address issues directly rather than perpetuating the culture that created them. Alexis nodded, making notes. There's one other matter, she added, her tone shifting slightly. Ander is here. He's asking to speak with you privately before the transition announcement to Montgomery senior staff this afternoon. I hadn't expected this, hadn't anticipated a face-to-face meeting so soon after the public revelation. Our confrontation, the pie, night before and his letter this morning had seemed like the extent of our personal interaction during this critical phase. Where is he? I asked, mentally adjusting to this development. The small conference room at the end of the hall, Alexis replied. We thought a neutral space would be preferable to your office. I appreciated the consideration. Meeting in my CEO office would have unnecessarily emphasized the power shift between us, a personal dynamic that didn't need reinforcement when the business reality was already clear. I found Ander standing at the window, looking out over the city skyline. He had recovered his composed appearance since our last encounter, impeccably dressed in his signature charcoal suit, hair perfectly styled, posture straight and controlled. Only the tension in his shoulders and the slight darkness beneath his eyes revealed the strain of the past 24 hours. He turned as I entered, his expression carefully neutral. Your interview was impressive, he said. Focused on business, minimal personal elements, smart approach. Thank you, I replied, equally measured. I understand you wanted to speak before the staff announcement? He nodded, gesturing to the conference table where several folders were arranged with characteristic precision. I've prepared detailed briefings on all Montgomery properties, he explained. The official records are comprehensive, but these include my personal observations, staff dynamics, client relationships, operational quirks that might not be captured in formal documentation. I moved to the table, surprised by this practical, helpful approach. That's thoughtful, I acknowledged. It will be valuable for the transition teams. I want this to succeed, Celia, he said quietly. Not just for the employees and clients, but because it's the right business decision. Artemis is better positioned to manage these properties than Montgomery would have been, even without the financial crisis. His acknowledgement was unexpected, a level of professional respect I hadn't anticipated given the circumstances. There's something else, he continued, removing a USB drive from his jacket pocket. This contains my personal analysis of what went wrong with Montgomery's expansion strategy, the mistakes I made, the warning signs I ignored, the cultural issues I fostered that allowed problems to be concealed rather than addressed. He placed the drive on the table beside the folders. It won't change what's happened, but perhaps it will help Artemis avoid similar pitfalls in the future. I studied him, searching for the pride or resentment I had expected. Instead, I found something that looked remarkably like acceptance, not just of the business situation, but of his role in creating it. "Why are you doing this?" I asked finally. "You could have simply stepped aside, taken your settlement, and disappeared to lick your wounds. Most people would in your position." Ander met my gaze directly, his expression contemplative. "Do you remember when we met? At the International Hotel Investment Conference?" "Of course," I replied, somewhat thrown by the change in direction. "You were the keynote speaker. I asked a question that challenged your projection models. And I was impressed," he continued, "not threatened. Intrigued by your perspective, not dismissive of it. Somewhere between then and now, that changed. I stopped seeing your intelligence as attractive and started seeing it as, I don't know, competitive? Maybe. Challenging to my self-image." He shook his head slightly as if still trying to understand his own evolution. "I built Montgomery around a singular vision. Mine. I never learned to truly incorporate other perspectives, to recognize that different approaches might be valid, or even superior. That worked when the company was small, when the industry was simpler. But as we expanded, it became a liability," I finished for him. "Exactly." He gestured to the folders and drive. "So I'm doing this because it's the right thing to do for the people who depend on these properties, staff and clients alike. And because maybe, in some small way, it addresses the fundamental flaw that brought us to this point. My inability to recognize and value perspectives different from my own." The sincerity in his voice was undeniable, cutting through my practiced professional detachment. This wasn't the defensive, angry reaction I had prepared for, nor the broken capitulation I had half expected. This was something else entirely, a clarity born from crisis, a recognition that seemed genuine rather than strategic. "I appreciate this," I said finally, indicating the materials he'd prepared. "It will make the transition smoother for everyone involved." He nodded, apparently satisfied with this acknowledgement. "There's one more thing," he added, reaching into his pocket and removing a small velvet box. "This belongs to you." I recognized it immediately. The vintage sapphire ring my grandmother had given me, the one I'd stopped wearing years ago when it became clear that Ander viewed me primarily as an extension of himself, rather than as an individual. "I found it in your jewelry box this morning," he explained. "You used to wear it all the time, then suddenly stopped. I never asked why." "It was my grandmother's," I said, accepting the box but not opening it. "She gave it to me when I graduated from Stanford. Said it was to remind me that I could achieve anything I set my mind to, regardless of what anyone else believed." Understanding dawned in his expression. "And you stopped wearing it when I started treating you as just a wife, rather than the accomplished person you are." "Yes," I admitted. "It felt inconsistent with who I'd become in our marriage." Ander nodded slowly. "Perhaps you'll wear it again now," he suggested. "Now that everyone can see what your grandmother already knew, and what I should have remembered." The moment stretched between us, laden with the weight of 8 years of marriage, of patterns established and expectations formed, of dismissals accumulated, and now perhaps of recognition finally offered. The transition announcement to senior. "Staff is at 3, I said, returning to practical matters rather than dwelling in emotional territory that felt too complex to navigate in this setting. "Will you be attending?" "If you think it would be helpful," he replied. "Some of them might." Respond better if they see us presenting a united front regarding the acquisition. I do, I confirmed. It would demonstrate that this is a business decision, not a personal vendetta. Then I'll be there, he said simply. He moved toward the door, then paused. For what it's worth, Celia, I am sorry. Not just for the company's failure, but for failing to see you clearly. For reducing you to a role, rather than recognizing the person filling it. As he left, I remained at the conference table, surrounded by the detailed briefings he had prepared. His final professional act as the founder of Montgomery Luxury Properties. The folders contained practical information that would facilitate the business transition. But his words had opened a different kind of transition, one less easily defined or managed, one whose outcomes remained uncertain. The sapphire ring in its velvet box sat before me, a tangible symbol of the person I had been before becoming. Just a wife. The person I had reclaimed as C.E. Adams, the person now fully visible to the world, and perhaps, finally, to the man who had once seen me clearly before his vision narrowed to fit his own expectations. 3 months after the acquisition, I stood in the grand ballroom of what had once been Montgomery Luxury's flagship property in Manhattan, now rebranded as the Artemis, New York. The space had been transformed for the evening's event, the formal launch of the integrated Artemis hospitality portfolio, combining the original Artemis properties with the former Montgomery locations under a unified brand and management philosophy. The guest list included industry leaders, financial analysts, media representatives, and key clients from both Artemis and Montgomery properties. It was, by any measure, the hospitality event of the season, marking not just a successful corporate acquisition, but the emergence of what financial press had already dubbed the new luxury hospitality powerhouse. Quite a triumph, Crystal Wilson remarked, appearing at my side with 2 glasses of champagne. She handed one to me, her expression openly admiring. 3 months from acquisition to full integration, with barely a hiccup in service at any property. The industry is impressed. I accepted the champagne with a smile. The transition teams exceeded expectations, and having detailed property briefings from the outset made an enormous difference. We both knew I was referring to Anders' comprehensive documentation, which had proven invaluable during the integration process. His insights into staff dynamics and operational quirks had allowed the Artemis teams to navigate potential pitfalls with unusual precision. Speaking of which, Crystal said, glancing across the room, your former husband seems to be adjusting to his new role rather well. I followed her gaze to where Anders stood in conversation with several hotel industry executives. As part of the acquisition agreement, he had accepted a 1-year consulting position, lending his expertise to the transition while gradually detaching from the company he had founded. The arrangement had raised eyebrows initially. Conventional. Wisdom suggested a clean break would be simpler, but over the past 3 months, it had proven surprisingly effective. He knows these properties better than anyone, I said, and he's been remarkably helpful throughout the process. Crystal studied me with characteristic perceptiveness. Just helpful? Or something more? The question touched on complexities I was still processing. In the month since the acquisition, Ander and I had maintained a strictly professional relationship during business hours. Our interactions had been focused entirely on the transition, property assessments, staff reorganizations, client continuity, strategies. The personal aspect of our relationship remained undefined, suspended in a state of neither reconciliation nor dissolution. It's evolving, I admitted. We haven't made any decisions about our marriage. The focus has been on stabilizing, the business first. Crystal nodded, understanding. And now that the business is stable? Before I could respond, Alexis appeared with her tablet in hand, professional as always despite the celebratory setting. I'm sorry to interrupt, but the presentation is scheduled to begin in 15 minutes. The technical team needs a final confirmation on the sequence. I excused myself from Crystal, grateful for the temporary reprieve from questions I wasn't yet ready to answer definitively. The truth was, I didn't know what would become of my relationship with Ander. The man who had emerged from the crisis of Montgomery Luxury's collapse, reflective, accountable, genuinely supportive of my leadership, bore little resemblance to the dismissive husband who had mocked my business acumen for years. Whether this transformation was permanent or merely a temporary response to dramatic circumstances remained to be seen. And whether it could possibly overcome the accumulated weight of years of dismissal was a question I had deliberately postponed addressing. After confirming the presentation details with the technical team, I made my way to a quiet corner of the ballroom to review my remarks one final time. The speech had been carefully crafted to emphasize business strategy and future vision, rather than dwelling on the unusual circumstances of the acquisition. Tonight was about looking forward, not backward. Nervous, I looked up to find Ander standing. Nearby, his expression thoughtful rather than challenging. Focused, I corrected with a small smile. It's an important moment for the company. He nodded, understanding the distinction. The integration data is impressive. Guest satisfaction scores have actually increased at the former Montgomery properties since the transition began. Your briefings made that possible, I acknowledged. Knowing the specific challenges at each location allowed us to address them systematically rather than discovering them through trial and error. A moment of comfortable silence fell between us, a rarity in our recent history, where conversations had been either professionally purposeful or awkwardly constrained by our undefined personal status. I've been thinking about what happens next, Ander said finally. My consulting agreement has 9 months remaining, but the critical transition phases are complete. You don't really need me anymore. The statement hung in the air, its professional meaning clear but its personal implications ambiguous. Are you suggesting an early termination of the agreement? I asked, keeping my tone neutral. I'm considering options, he replied carefully. I've received several offers, advisory roles, investment opportunities, even a university position teaching hotel management. All outside the competitive radius specified in our agreement, of course. Of course, I echoed, processing this information. The possibility of Ander leaving Artemis, leaving New York entirely perhaps, hadn't factored into my immediate plans. Yet it made logical sense. The man who had built Montgomery Luxury from the ground up was unlikely to find long-term satisfaction in a supporting role at the company that had acquired it, regardless of who led that company. And what about... I hesitated, unsure how to phrase the question that necessarily followed. Us? He finished for me. That's a separate consideration, one I thought we might discuss when you're ready. When we're both ready. I studied him, noting the careful way he had separated the professional decision from the personal one, giving me space to consider each on its own merits rather than as a package deal. It was a subtle but significant departure from his historical approach, where personal and professional concerns had been inextricably linked according to his preferences alone. Before I could respond, Alexis appeared again, signaling that it was time for the presentation to begin. The moment for personal discussion would have to wait. Ms. Adams, she said formally, conscious of the public setting. We're ready for you. I nodded, gathering my notes. We'll continue this conversation later, I told Ander, who acknowledged with a simple nod before stepping back to allow me to proceed to the stage. As I moved through the crowd toward the podium, I felt the weight of my grandmother's sapphire ring on my finger, restored to its place after years in a jewelry box, a tangible reminder of the journey from dismissed wife to recognized business leader. Whatever happened next, with the company, with Ander, with the life I was now publicly reclaiming, would be my choice, made from a position of acknowledged strength rather than underestimated potential. The spotlight found me as I took my place at the podium, the assembled industry leaders and media representatives falling silent in anticipation. 3 months ago, Many of them had been shocked to discover that the mysterious C.E. Adams was actually Celia Montgomery, dismissed as just a wife by the man whose company she had acquired. Tonight, they waited to hear from Celia Adams, CEO of the newly expanded Artemis Hospitality Group, recognized not for the unusual circumstances of her rise to prominence but for the business acumen that had made it possible. "Good evening," I began, my voice steady and clear. "Thank you for joining us to celebrate not just the completion of an acquisition, but the beginning of a new chapter in luxury hospitality." As I continued with my prepared remarks, outlining Artemis's vision and strategy for the future, I caught Anders' eye in the audience. His expression held something I had rarely seen during our marriage: genuine, unqualified respect. Not for my role in relation to him, but for my capabilities independent of any connection to him. It was, I realized, what I had wanted all along. Not revenge or vindication, but simply recognition. The opportunity to be seen clearly, to have my abilities acknowledged rather than dismissed, to be valued for what I could achieve rather than how I could support someone else's achievements. The acquisition of Montgomery Luxury had made that recognition public and undeniable. But the more meaningful recognition had come privately, in Anders' letter the morning of the acquisition, in his helpful transition support, in the respectful way he now treated me as a business equal rather than a decorative accessory. Whether that recognition could form the foundation for a renewed personal relationship remained an open question, one I was now free to consider from a position of strength rather than limitation, of choice rather than constraint. For now, I focused on the business at hand, guiding the audience through Artemis's plans for the future, no longer hidden in the shadows as C.E. Adams nor dismissed as just a wife, but fully visible as exactly who I had always been: a capable, strategic business leader whose greatest advantage had turned out to be the very underestimation I had finally overcome. 3 months after the acquisition, I stood in the grand ballroom of what had once been Montgomery Luxury's flagship property. In Manhattan, now rebranded as the Artemis New York. The space had been transformed for the evening's event, the formal launch of the integrated Artemis hospitality portfolio, combining the original Artemis properties with the former Montgomery locations under a unified brand and management philosophy. The guest list included industry leaders, financial analysts, media representatives, and key clients from both Artemis and Montgomery properties. It was, by any measure, the hospitality event of the season, marking not just a successful corporate acquisition, but the emergence of what financial press had already dubbed the new luxury hospitality powerhouse. "Quite a triumph," Crystal Wilson remarked, appearing at my side with 2 glasses of champagne. She handed one to me, her expression openly admiring. 3 months from acquisition to full integration, with barely a hiccup in service at any property. The industry is impressed. I accepted the champagne with a smile. The transition teams exceeded expectations, and having detailed property briefings from the outset made an enormous difference. We both knew I was referring to Anders' comprehensive documentation, which had proven invaluable during the integration process. His insights into staff dynamics and operational quirks had allowed the Artemis teams to navigate potential pitfalls with unusual precision. "Speaking of which," Crystal said, glancing across the room, "your former husband seems to be adjusting to his new role rather well." I followed her gaze to where Anders stood in conversation with several hotel industry executives. As part of the acquisition agreement, he had accepted a 1-year consulting position, lending his expertise to the transition while gradually detaching from the company he had founded. The arrangement had raised eyebrows initially. Conventional. Wisdom suggested a clean break would be simpler, but over the past 3 months it had proven surprisingly effective. "He knows these properties better than anyone," I said, "and he's been remarkably helpful throughout the process." Crystal studied me with characteristic perceptiveness. "Just helpful? Or something more?" The question touched on complexities I was still processing. In the months since the acquisition, Ander and I had maintained a strictly professional relationship during business hours. Our interactions had been focused entirely on the transition, property, assessments, staff reorganizations, client continuity strategies. The personal aspect of our relationship remained undefined, suspended in a state of neither reconciliation nor dissolution. It's evolving, I admitted. We haven't made any decisions about our marriage. The focus has been on stabilizing the high. Business first. Crystal nodded, understanding. And now that the business is stable? Before I could respond, Alexis appeared with her tablet in hand, professional as always despite the celebratory setting. I'm sorry to interrupt, but the presentation is scheduled to begin in 15 minutes. The technical team needs a final confirmation on the sequence. I excused myself from Crystal, grateful for the temporary reprieve from questions I wasn't yet ready to answer definitively. The truth was, I didn't know what would become of my relationship with Ander. The man who had emerged from the crisis of Montgomery Luxury's collapse, reflective, accountable, genuinely supportive of my leadership, bore little resemblance to the dismissive husband who had mocked my business acumen for years. Whether this transformation was permanent or merely a temporary response to dramatic circumstances remained to be seen. And whether it could possibly overcome the accumulated weight of years of dismissal was a question I had deliberately postponed addressing. After confirming the presentation details with the technical team, I made my way to a quiet corner of the ballroom to review my remarks one final time. The speech had been carefully crafted to emphasize business strategy and future vision rather than dwelling on the unusual circumstances of the acquisition. Tonight was about looking forward, not backward. Nervous? I looked up to find Ander standing nearby, his expression thoughtful rather than challenging. Focused, I corrected with a small smile. It's an important moment for the company. He nodded, understanding the distinction. The integration data is impressive. Guest satisfaction scores have actually increased at the former Montgomery properties since the transition began. Your briefings made that possible, I acknowledged. Knowing the specific challenges at each location allowed us to address them systematically, rather than discovering them through trial and error. A moment of comfortable silence fell between us, a rarity in our recent history, where conversations had been either professionally purposeful or awkwardly constrained by our undefined personal status. I've been thinking about what happens next, Ander said finally. My consulting agreement has 9 months remaining, but the critical transition phases are complete. You don't really need me anymore. The statement hung in the air, its professional meaning clear, but its personal implications ambiguous. Are you suggesting an early termination of the agreement? I asked, keeping my tone neutral. I'm considering options, he replied carefully. I've received several offers, advisory roles, investment opportunities, even a university position teaching hotel management. All outside the competitive radius specified in our agreement, of course. Of course, I echoed, processing this information. The possibility of Ander leaving Artemis, leaving New York entirely, perhaps, hadn't factored into my immediate plans. Yet it made logical sense. The man who had built Montgomery Luxury from the ground up was unlikely to find long-term satisfaction in a supporting role at the company that had acquired it, regardless of who led that company. And what about... I hesitated, unsure how to phrase the question that necessarily followed. Us? He finished for me. That's a separate consideration, one I thought we might discuss when you're ready, when we're both ready. I studied him, noting the careful way he had separated the professional decision from the personal one, giving me space to consider each on its own merits rather than as a package deal. It was a subtle but significant departure from his historical approach, where personal and professional concerns had been inextricably linked according to his preferences alone. Before I could respond, Alexis appeared again, signaling that it was time for the presentation to begin. The moment for personal discussion would have to wait. Ms. Adams, she said formally, conscious of the public setting, we're ready for you. I nodded, gathering my notes. We'll continue this conversation later, I told Ander, who acknowledged with a simple nod before stepping back to allow me to proceed to the stage. As I moved through the crowd toward the podium, I felt the weight of my grandmother's sapphire ring on my finger, restored to its place after years in a jewelry box, a tangible reminder of the journey from dismissed wife to recognized business leader. Whatever happened next, with the company, with Ander, with the life I was now publicly reclaiming, would be my choice, made from a position of acknowledged strength rather than underestimated potential. The spotlight found me as I took my place at the podium, the assembled industry leaders and media representatives falling silent in anticipation. 3 months ago, many of them had been shocked to discover that the mysterious C.E. Adams was actually Celia Montgomery, dismissed as just a wife by the man whose company she had acquired. Tonight, they waited to hear from Celia Adams, CEO, of the newly expanded Artemis Hospitality Group, recognized not for the unusual circumstances of her rise to prominence, but for the business acumen that had made it possible. Good evening, I began, my voice steady and clear. Thank you for joining us to celebrate not just the completion of an acquisition, but the beginning of a new chapter in luxury hospitality. As I continued with my prepared remarks, outlining Artemis's vision and strategy for the future, I caught Anders' eye in the audience. His expression held something I had rarely seen during our marriage: genuine, unqualified respect. Not for my role in relation to him, but for my capabilities independent of any connection to him. It was, I realized, what I had wanted all along. Not revenge or vindication, but simply recognition. The opportunity to be seen clearly, to have my abilities acknowledged rather than dismissed, to be valued for what I could achieve rather than how I could support someone else's achievements. The acquisition of Montgomery Luxury had made that recognition public and undeniable. But the more meaningful recognition had come privately, in Anders' letter the morning of the acquisition, in his helpful transition support, in the respectful way he now treated me as a business equal rather than a decorative accessory. Whether that recognition could form the foundation for a renewed personal relationship remained an open question. One I was now free to consider from a position of strength rather than limitation, of choice rather than constraint. For now, I focused on the business at hand, guiding the audience through Artemis's plans for the future, no longer hidden in the shadows as C.E. Adams nor dismissed as just a wife, but fully visible as exactly who I had always been: a capable, strategic business leader whose greatest advantage had turned out to be the very underestimation I had finally overcome. 6 months after the integration celebration, I stood at the floor-to-ceiling windows of the Artemis Executive Suite, watching the late afternoon sunlight gild the city skyline. The view was different from the one I'd had in my lady's study at home. More expansive, more public, the visibility a fitting metaphor for the transformation my life had undergone. My phone buzzed with a message from Ashley. Forbes interview, confirmed for tomorrow at 11. They're focusing on the 1-year acquisition anniversary piece. The business press had maintained steady interest in the Artemis Montgomery story, though the angle had gradually shifted from the personal drama to the business success. The integration had exceeded financial projections, with the former Montgomery properties showing significant improvement in both guest satisfaction and profit margins once Artemis management principles were fully implemented. Even more gratifying had been the industry recognition. Last month, Hospitality Executive had named me Industry Innovator of the Year, specifically citing the seamless merger of the two distinct brand philosophies into a cohesive luxury experience. The award ceremony had been particularly satisfying, as several executives who had once smiled indulgently at my charming interest in hotel operations now approached me for insights into market trends. A knock at my office door interrupted my reflections. Alexis entered with her tablet in hand, her expression businesslike as always despite the late hour. "The Singapore property final assessment is complete," she reported. "The construction issues were even more extensive than initially documented, but the remediation team believes they can complete the necessary structural work without significantly impacting the aesthetic design. Updated timeline and budget are ready for your review." I nodded, unsurprised by the findings. The Singapore property had been the most problematic of Montgomery's Asian expansion sites, with multiple layers of concealed deficiencies that had emerged during our comprehensive audit. Unlike the previous management, which had masked problems to protect the expansion narrative, Artemis had taken the opposite approach: complete transparency followed by strategic resolution. "And the Dubai numbers?" I asked, referring to the property whose fraudulent performance projections had precipitated Montgomery Luxury's collapse. "Stabilized," Alexis confirmed. 6 consecutive months of authentic growth once we implemented the revised positioning strategy. Still below the fabricated projections that were presented to investors, but significantly above industry averages for the market. "Send the full reports to my secure server," I instructed. "I'll review them tonight." As Alexis turned to leave, she paused. "Also, Mr. Montgomery's final consulting report was submitted this afternoon. He's completed the last property assessments as requested." The formal reference to Ander as Mr. Montgomery reflected the professional boundaries that had been maintained throughout the transition period. Despite working together regularly on the integration, we had carefully separated our business interactions from the more complex personal questions that remained unresolved. "Thank you," I said. "Is he still in the building?" "No," she replied. "He mentioned having a dinner engagement, but he did ask if you would call him when you had a chance to review the report. He said it contains some additional observations beyond the specific property assessments." After Alexis departed, I opened Anders' report on my tablet, curious about these additional observations. The document was characteristically thorough, with detailed analyses of each property's current position and future potential. But the final section, titled Integration Reflections, departed from the business focus into more personal territory. In analyzing the successful integration of Montgomery properties into the Artemis portfolio, one factor deserves particular acknowledgement: the fundamental difference in management philosophy between the two organizations. Montgomery Luxury operated on a centralized model, with major decisions flowing from a single vision: mine. This approach created consistency, but limited innovation and obscured problems that didn't align with established narratives. Artemis, by contrast, has implemented what I've come to recognize as a more resilient model: distributed expertise within a cohesive framework. This balance between clear brand standards and operational flexibility has allowed former Montgomery properties to maintain their distinctive character while addressing the structural weaknesses that had developed under my leadership. This observation isn't merely professional, it's personal as well. The same centralized thinking that ultimately undermined Montgomery Luxury also damaged my marriage. I approached both my company and my relationship with the conviction that my perspective was inherently correct, leaving little room for alternative viewpoints or collaborative development. The past 9 months working within the Artemis structure have demonstrated a better approach, one that values multiple perspectives, embraces constructive challenge, and recognizes that the strongest organizations, like the strongest relationships, thrive on mutual respect rather than rigid hierarchy. As disatsi. My consulting role concludes, I want to express my appreciation for the opportunity to participate in this process. It has been professionally illuminating and personally transformative. I read the section twice, struck by the parallels Ander had drawn between his business failure and our relationship challenges. The insight showed a level of self-awareness I wouldn't have attributed to him a year ago, a capacity for critical reflection that suggested genuine evolution rather than strategic adaptation to changed circumstances. My phone rang, pulling me from these thoughts. The screen displayed Anders' name. "I just finished reading your report," I said when I answered. "Thorough as always." "Including the final section?" he asked, his tone careful. "Yes," I confirmed. "The parallels you drew between management philosophy and personal relationships were insightful." A brief pause before he responded. "Not just theoretical observations. I've had considerable time to reflect on both failures, the company and our marriage. The patterns were remarkably similar." Another pause, longer this time. "Celia, I'm calling because I've made a decision about my next steps. I've accepted a position with the Cornell School of Hotel Administration. They've created a new chair in hospitality innovation, focusing on sustainability practices and adaptive management models." The news wasn't entirely unexpected. Ander had mentioned teaching possibilities months earlier, but the specifics were significant. Cornell was in Ithaca, hundreds of miles from New York City. This wasn't just a new professional direction. It represented a geographic separation as well. "That's an excellent opportunity," I said, keeping my voice neutral despite the complex emotions the announcement triggered. "When do you start?" "Next semester," he replied. "I'll be relocating to Ithaca in 6 weeks." The implications hung between us, unspoken but unavoidable. For months, we had existed in a professional limbo. Our personal relationship neither resumed nor formally dissolved. Anders' move would force a resolution one way or the other. "I'd like to talk about what this means," he continued. "Not over the phone. Would you have dinner with me tomorrow night? The River Cafe at 8? The River Cafe had been the site of our first date 10 years earlier, a deliberate choice that signaled this wouldn't be a business discussion. "Yes," I agreed. "I'll be there." After ending the call, I returned to the window, watching as office lights began illuminating the darkening city. The past year had transformed both my professional standing and personal understanding. I had emerged from the shadows of just a wife to claim my rightful position as a respected business leader. The acquisition that had begun as a strategic opportunity had evolved into something more complex. Not revenge, as the media had initially framed it, but a recalibration of power and perception. Now Ander was creating his own transformation, moving from the identity of successful founder to that of academic and thought leader. The geographical distance this entailed would necessitate clarity about our relationship. Continuing together would require deliberate choice rather than comfortable inertia. As I gathered my things to leave the office, I realized I felt neither dread nor anxiety about the impending conversation. Whatever direction we chose, it would be a decision made between equals. Two people who had finally seen each other clearly, without the distortions of ego or expectation that had clouded our previous years together. The sapphire ring caught. The last light as I reached for my coat, my grandmother's gift, reclaimed after years in darkness. Whether Ander and I found a new foundation or acknowledged the irreparable fractures in our relationship, I would move forward as myself, fully visible, fully valued, no longer dismissed or diminished by anyone's limited perception. The woman, who had been mocked as just a wife, had reclaimed not just a company, but herself. That was the true acquisition, the one that could never be surrendered or devalued. That was the victory that mattered most. As the elevator descended toward the lobby, I made a mental note to call Crystal Wilson in the morning. Her foundation, Supporting Female Entrepreneurs, was hosting a mentorship event next week, an opportunity to share the lessons of my journey with women just beginning theirs. Perhaps some of them faced similar dismissals, similar underestimation. Perhaps my story might help them recognize that being underestimated could become their greatest advantage if they had the patience and strategy to use it effectively. The thought brought a smile as I stepped into the evening air. The path forward remained undefined in some respects, but the essential truth had been established beyond question. I had always been more than just a wife. And now, finally, everyone knew it. including the man who had once been too blind to see. When my story first became public, the wife who built a hospitality empire while her husband dismissed her as incapable, I received thousands of messages from women who saw their own experiences reflected in mine. Not the specific circumstances, of course. Few women secretly build companies that eventually acquire their husbands' businesses, but the fundamental experience of being underestimated, dismissed or defined by their relationship to someone else rather than by their own capabilities, that resonated with countless women across industries and circumstances. So today, I want to speak directly to those of you who have felt that particular sting of dismissal, who have watched your ideas be ignored, only to be celebrated when repeated, by someone else, who have been introduced as someone's wife rather than as a professional in your own right. First, let me acknowledge the reality. Being underestimated hurts. When Ander would laugh off my business insights at dinner parties or explain to others what I couldn't possibly understand, each dismissal cut deeply. There's a special kind of pain in having your capabilities denied by someone who is supposed to see and value you fully. I want you to know that your feelings of frustration, anger, or hurt in similar situations are entirely valid. But I also want to share what became the most unexpected lesson of my journey. Sometimes, being underestimated can become your greatest strategic advantage. When people don't see your full capabilities, they also don't create obstacles to prevent your success. They don't view you as competition. They don't scrutinize your actions with suspicion or resistance. They simply don't pay attention, and that inattention can create space for you to build something extraordinary. In my case, Anders' absolute conviction that I couldn't understand complex business matters gave me the perfect cover to build Artemis Hospitality, while he remained completely unaware. His dismissal became my opportunity. Now, I'm not suggesting you need to operate in secrecy for years as I did. My approach was specific to my circumstances, but I am encouraging you to consider how the very underestimation that frustrates you might also offer unexpected freedom or opportunity. Another crucial lesson from my experience is the importance of separating your identity from others' perceptions. Throughout those years of dismissal, I never internalized Anders' limited view of me. I recognized it as his failure of perception, not my limitation of ability. This separation is essential. When someone dismisses your ideas or contributions, their assessment reflects their biases and limitations, not your worth or potential. Guard your self-knowledge fiercely against others' diminished perceptions of you. I maintained this separation partly through the support of people who did see me clearly. Crystal Wilson, who recognized my business acumen. Alexis Gardner, who respected my strategic vision. Even my grandmother, whose sapphire ring reminded me of who I truly was beneath the just a wife facade. These support networks are vital when navigating environments where your value isn't recognized. Find people who see your capabilities clearly, who validate your perspective, who remind you of your worth when others try to diminish you. And when possible, be that person for other women facing similar dismissal. One strategy that served me particularly well was using spaces coded as feminine and therefore unimportant to house my most significant work. My ladies' study, dismissed by Ander as merely the place where I managed household accounts, became the command center for my business empire precisely because he undervalued anything associated with traditional femininity. Look for similar opportunities in your own context, areas that are overlooked or undervalued because of their association with femininity, which might provide unexpected freedom for meaningful work precisely because they're not taken seriously. Throughout my journey, I learned the importance of maintaining professional focus amid personal dynamics. When the acquisition opportunity arose, I made decisions based on what would benefit Artemis Hospitality, not what would most effectively humiliate or punish Ander for years of dismissal. This professional focus amid complex personal feelings demonstrates leadership maturity and ultimately commands more respect than decisions driven by emotional reaction. It's particularly crucial for women whose emotional responses are often scrutinized more harshly than men's. Perhaps most importantly, I learned to value recognition over revenge. Although the media initially framed my acquisition of Montgomery luxury as revenge for years of dismissal, my true motivation was more nuanced. I wasn't primarily seeking to punish Ander, but to create a successful business and eventually to be recognized for my genuine capabilities. This distinction matters. Focusing on revenge keeps you oriented around the person who harmed you, while focusing on achievement and rightful recognition centers your own goals and growth. The satisfaction I felt came not from seeing Anders' company collapse, but from finally being acknowledged for the business leader I had always been. I also discovered the power of strategic visibility, choosing when and how to be seen. For years, I operated as the deliberately low-profile C.E. Adams, recognizing that anonymity provided advantages in a business world that often judges female leaders differently than male ones. When circumstances required me to step into public view, I did so on my own terms, controlling the narrative and emphasizing business results rather than personal drama. This approach can be powerful in environments that subject women to heightened scrutiny or double standards. Sometimes maintaining a low profile allows your work to speak for itself without the distortion of gender expectations. Other times, claiming public recognition becomes necessary to advance your goals. Finally, I want to acknowledge something that surprised me. Relationships can sometimes transform through recognition. Ander evolved from dismissing me as just a wife to recognizing me as a business equal with superior strategic vision. This transformation wasn't immediate or easy, but it demonstrated that relationships can sometimes evolve when fundamental respect replaces entrenched dismissal. Not all dismissive relationships can or should be salvaged. That's a deeply personal decision only you can make for your specific circumstances. But my journey showed me that genuine recognition, seeing someone clearly for who they truly are, can sometimes create the foundation for a new kind of connection based on mutual respect rather than hierarchical assumptions. Your own path will be different from mine. Most of you won't be secretly building companies while being dismissed as just a wife. But the fundamental principles apply across contexts. Maintain your self-knowledge despite others' diminished perceptions. Find strategic advantages in being underestimated. Build networks of people who see your true capabilities. Focus on achievement and recognition rather than revenge. And choose visibility strategically. Most importantly, remember that your capabilities are real regardless of others' ability to recognize them. The people who dismiss you reveal their own limitations, not yours. I'd love to hear your own experiences. How have you responded to being underestimated? What strategies have worked for you? What challenges are you still navigating? Share your insights in the comments below. Your perspective might be exactly what another woman in our community needs to hear today. Remember, sometimes being underestimated is the perfect cover for building something extraordinary. Just as I was always more than just a wife, you are more than how others choose to see you. Claim that truth and build from there. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.